Don't take me home.
My father-in-law said it so quietly that at first I thought I'd misunderstood him. Then his hand tightened around my forearm. For an 82-year-old man who had just walked out of a hospital after a stroke, he had a surprisingly strong grip. "Michael," he whispered, "drive to Susan Miller's office." I looked toward the hospital entrance. His sons were supposed to be waiting there. Rick, Dennis, my wife, Linda. All three had supposedly been too busy to pick him up. "Harold, are you sure?" He looked at me. I had known that man for 30 years. I'd seen him angry, sick, exhausted, grieving. But I had never seen fear in his eyes. Until that moment. "Before they realize I'm gone," he whispered. I started the engine. What I didn't know was that the man sitting beside me had spent 7 years preparing for the possibility that his own children might betray him. And by the time I understood why he'd chosen me, my marriage would be hanging by a thread, my reputation would be destroyed, and nearly everyone in town would believe I had manipulated an old man for his money. The truth was much worse. I wasn't taking Harold away from his family. I was driving him away from people who were already planning what to do with his property after he died. And I had no idea that by helping him that morning, I was stepping into the biggest fight of my life. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 58 years old. For most of my life, I repaired heating and air conditioning systems around central Ohio. It wasn't glamorous work. I spent winters crawling into freezing basements and summers sweating inside attic spaces while furnaces and compressors fought me every inch of the way. My hands carried the scars to prove it. I never cared. Honest work paid the bills. My wife, Linda, and I had been married for 30 years. We lived in a modest ranch outside Columbus. The mortgage was paid off. We had 2 aging pickup trucks and enough retirement savings to live comfortably if we didn't get stupid with money. That was enough for me. It wasn't enough for Linda's brothers. Rick Bennett was the oldest. He owned a commercial landscaping company and had developed the habit of measuring every conversation by money. Dennis sold commercial real estate. He could turn a family dinner into an investment seminar before anyone finished dessert. They were never openly cruel to me. That would have been easier. Instead, they smiled. They asked questions. The kind of questions that reminded you where they thought you belonged. "Still keeping busy with the HVAC work, Mike? You ever think about doing something bigger? 30 years of crawling under houses. You must be ready to move up eventually." I always laughed. Linda usually changed the subject. And I told myself that was marriage. You overlook things. You let things go. You don't turn every insult into a fight. Then there was Harold, their father. He was different. He never cared what I drove. Never asked how much I made. Never looked at my hands and saw a man beneath him. Whenever I visited the family farm near Lancaster, Harold would sit on the porch and wave me over. "Coffee's fresh." That was usually enough. We'd sit there for hours. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Those quiet mornings became some of my favorite memories. 12 days before the hospital incident, Harold suffered a stroke while feeding cattle. A neighbor found him quickly. The doctors were optimistic. They said his recovery should be good. Every day, I asked Linda if she wanted to visit. Sometimes we went together. Other times she said Rick and Dennis were already there. I didn't question it. Then, on the morning Harold was discharged, our family group chat started before sunrise. Rick couldn't leave because of an emergency shareholders meeting. Dennis had a golf tournament with potential clients. Linda said she'd promised months earlier to lead a church ministry meeting. Then came the message. Mike can make the drive. Nobody asked me. They simply assigned it to me. I looked across the kitchen. Linda was pouring coffee. I'll go, I said. Thanks. She didn't even look up. I left before daylight. The drive to Columbus was long and quiet. I liked driving without the radio. It gave me room to think. Or, more accurately, room to avoid thinking. When Harold climbed into my truck, he looked tired but alert. I asked how he felt. Like I've been hit by a truck. I laughed. He didn't. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, he reached toward the dashboard. Click. The doors locked. I glanced at him. He reached into his flannel pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. It looked ancient. What is that? Something you need to hear. He pressed play. Static filled the cab. Then, a voice. Rick. If we divide Southfield into residential lots, we can double what the land is worth. Dennis laughed. No reason to wait around forever. Dad probably won't make another Christmas. A pause. Then Rick again. We should start talking to developers now. A hospital monitor beeped somewhere in the background. I stared at the road. Harold pressed stop. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I pretended to be asleep, he said. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. They never knew I was listening. I swallowed. Harold. I've listened to that recording every day since. I didn't know what to say. So I said the only thing that came to mind. I'm sorry. He looked through the passenger window. So am I. Another mile passed. Then he said something that changed the entire meaning of that morning. I've waited 12 years for today. I turned toward him. What does that mean? He looked at me. You'll find out. And then he gave me an address. Susan Miller. His attorney. The woman I'd never heard him mention once in 30 years. When we arrived at her office, she didn't look surprised to see us. That was my first clue. She had been waiting. The second came when Harold placed a small brass key on her desk. Susan opened a fireproof cabinet. Inside was a sealed envelope. It's been here 7 years, she said. I looked at Harold. 7 years? He nodded. I hoped I'd never need it. Susan opened the envelope. Inside were handwritten notes. Property records. Dates. Letters. Copies of documents. Everything arranged with the patience of someone who had been preparing for a storm long before anyone else saw clouds. Harold looked at me. People don't become greedy overnight, Michael. He paused. They become greedy one decision at a time. Susan quietly left the room. Harold leaned back. Do you remember those fishing trips? I smiled. Sure, you were always busy. No. He shook his head. I wasn't. My smile disappeared. I invited you. I never got the invitations. I know. The room seemed to shrink. Then Harold said the thing I would remember for the rest of my life. There are things Linda doesn't know. He stopped, then corrected himself. And there are things she chose not to know. My phone vibrated. Linda. Then Rick. Then Dennis. 3 calls in less than a minute. I turned the phone face down. Harold watched me. By tonight, he said quietly, everyone in my family is going to hate you. I looked at him. Why? He didn't answer. He only pushed the sealed envelope toward me. Because when the truth comes out, Michael, his voice dropped, they'll need someone to blame. And for some reason, I knew exactly who that someone would be. By the time we left Susan Miller's office, it was almost 2 in the afternoon. Harold sat beside me in silence. I kept thinking about the envelope. 7 years of preparation. The recording. The property documents. And one sentence I couldn't get out of my head. By tonight, everyone in my family is going to hate you. 20 miles outside Columbus, I finally broke the silence. Harold. He turned toward me. Did Linda know about the recording? No. Did she know Rick and Dennis were talking to developers? I don't believe so. I waited. Harold rested one hand against the dashboard. She stopped asking questions years ago. That answer hurt more than I expected. Because I knew exactly what he meant. Some people lie. Others simply stop wanting to know the truth. We reached the farmhouse a little after 4. 3 vehicles sat in the driveway. Rick's black Yukon. Dennis's Lexus. Linda's Subaru. The moment I pulled in, Rick came charging out of the house. Where the hell have you been? He didn't ask his father how he felt. He didn't ask whether the drive had been difficult. His first question was where I'd taken Harold. You've been gone 6 hours. Dennis came behind him. We've been calling all day. Harold slowly opened the passenger door. Rick's expression changed instantly. Dad. His voice softened. We were worried sick. Harold leaned on his cane. No. Rick blinked. You were curious. The smile disappeared from Rick's face. Harold walked toward the porch. I grabbed his overnight bag. Neither brother followed him. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Inside, Linda rushed to her father. She hugged him carefully. I'm glad you're home. Harold smiled. So am I. Then Linda turned to me. Can we talk later? Her voice was gentle. Almost rehearsed. Sure. Dinner was worse. Nobody mentioned the hospital. Nobody mentioned the lawyer. Nobody mentioned the recording. We sat around the table like strangers pretending to be a family. 5 minutes passed before Rick finally put down his fork. So, he said, looking straight at me.
Where exactly did you two go?
I took another bite of potatoes.
Out.
Dennis laughed.
Out where?
Before I could answer, Harold spoke. I asked Michael to drive me. Rick smiled. Dad, if something important happened, we're your children. Harold slowly raised his eyes. Then perhaps you should have come to the hospital. Silence. Rick's jaw tightened. Dennis suddenly became fascinated by his plate. Linda stared at her hands. Dinner ended soon after. Around 11:30 that night, I went downstairs for water. When I reached the garage, I stopped. The light inside my truck was on. Linda stood beside the driver's seat. She was searching through the center console. Then the glove compartment. Then the registration folder.
What are you doing?
She spun around. A flashlight slipped from her hand. I was looking for something.
What?
She hesitated. The receipt.
What receipt?
Her eyes met mine. The lawyer. My stomach tightened.
You followed me.
No. Linda. She folded her arms. Rick thinks your father changed something. Your father. She corrected herself immediately. Dad. What did he sign? I thought about Harold's warning. I thought about the envelope in my jacket. I can't tell you. Her expression changed. You won't tell me? I gave him my word. I'm your wife. I know. Then why does your promise to my father matter more than your marriage? I stared at her. Because your father is the only person who ever asked me to keep one. For several seconds, she didn't move. Then she turned and walked toward the house. Halfway to the door, she stopped. You've never kept secrets from me. I almost answered. I almost told her about the fishing trips. The invitations Harold said he'd sent. The things Linda had apparently never told me. Instead, I said, I can't break my promise. She went upstairs. A bedroom door slammed. The next morning, Susan called before 8. Michael. Oh. Her voice was unusually serious. Harold completed everything. I sat down. Everything? The trust is now effective. I looked toward the bedroom. What happens now? Susan paused. Things may become uncomfortable for a while. She was right. By Thursday, the rumors had begun. Lancaster was a small town. People didn't spread news. They detonated it. At Miller's Hardware, conversations stopped when I walked through the door. At the diner, 2 men lowered their voices as I passed. At church, people smiled at me differently. After the service, an older man I'd known for years pulled me aside. Mike. He hesitated. I hope what people are saying isn't true. What are they saying? He looked around before answering. That you convinced Harold to cut his children out. My stomach dropped. I would never do that. I didn't think you would. Then why are you telling me? Because people are talking. I drove home angry. Not because people were talking. Because someone had given them a story. And that story had a villain. Me. A few days later, I noticed a gray SUV parked across from our house. The next day, I saw it outside one of my service calls. The third time, it was sitting near the grocery store. I walked toward it. The engine started. The SUV disappeared. That evening, I called Susan. "I think someone is following me." She sighed. "I was afraid of that." "You knew?" "Rick hired a private investigator." I sat down hard. "Why?" "He thinks you manipulated Harold." I laughed once. "I'm an HVAC technician." "I know." "Why would anyone believe that?" "Because Rick doesn't need everyone to know the truth." She paused. "He only needs them to doubt yours." That sentence stayed with me. And Rick was getting better at it. Within another week, customers started canceling. One of them called while I was sitting in my truck. "Mike, I'm going with another company." "No problem." There was silence. Then he added, "I've heard some things." I looked through the windshield. "What things?" "I'd rather not get into it." He hung up. 2 more customers canceled by Friday. Then the bank called. I went in expecting a routine renewal. Instead, the manager closed his office door. "Michael, underwriting wants additional documentation." "For what?" He looked embarrassed. "Potential litigation." "I haven't been sued." "There's an inheritance dispute involving your name." I stared at him. "I haven't inherited anything." "I understand. But someone has already decided I'm guilty." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Rick wasn't just fighting me in court. He was trying to make me financially weak enough to stop fighting back. That night, Linda and I barely spoke. The silence between us had become its own language. 2 people who had spent 30 years knowing how the other took their coffee were suddenly afraid to ask what the other was thinking. One evening, I found her sitting on the back porch. The sun was disappearing behind the maple trees. I sat beside her. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "Do you really believe I'd steal from your father?" She kept looking toward the yard. "I don't know what to believe anymore. You know me." She finally looked at me. "I thought I did." That hurt. "Why won't you tell me what happened that day?" "Because I promised him." "You're my wife." "I know." "Then prove you trust me." I lowered my eyes. "I can't." She stood. "So your promise to my father matters more than your marriage?" "No." "Then what is it?" I looked at her. "It's the only promise anyone in this family has ever trusted me enough to keep." She stared at me. Then she walked inside. 3 days later, I packed an overnight bag. Linda watched from the hallway. "You're leaving?" "No. I need some space." "For how long?" "I don't know." I drove to a small motel outside Lancaster. The room was cheap. The carpet was faded. The air conditioner rattled. I spent 20 minutes fixing its loose front panel before realizing what I was doing. Old habits. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed. Maybe I should quit. Maybe I should tell Susan I wanted nothing to do with the trust. Maybe Harold had made a mistake choosing me. Around midnight, I grabbed my keys. I started the truck. I was going back to Linda. I was going to tell her I was done keeping secrets for a family that hated me. Then, my phone rang. Harold. I stared at the screen. For 1 second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered. Hi. His breathing sounded weak. Can you come? Of course. I don't have much time tonight. 20 minutes later, I was back at the farmhouse. Harold was sitting on the porch beneath the stars. He looked smaller than he had that morning. Older. Tired. He motioned for me to sit. I knew you'd come. I swallowed. I almost didn't. I know. I looked at him.
How?
He smiled faintly. I've lived 82 years. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out the same sealed envelope I'd been carrying for days. Michael, he whispered, before I die, there's something you need to know about Rick. He placed the envelope in my hands. 12 years ago, he almost lost everything. I looked down at my name. Harold's voice dropped. And you were the one who saved him. I stared at him. I don't remember doing that. You weren't supposed to. Then he told me the truth. And suddenly, the family I thought I understood looked completely different.
12 years ago, Harold said, Rick's company was collapsing.
I stared at him. I remember.
No, you remember that he almost went bankrupt.
He shook his head.
You don't know what happened before that.
The October air had turned cold around us. Somewhere beyond the barn, a horse shifted inside the stable. Harold looked toward the dark fields. Rick needed $90,000. I frowned.
From you?
I didn't have it. He looked back at me.
You did.
I felt my chest tighten. 12 years earlier, Rick's landscaping company had been drowning in debt. He'd hidden it from almost everyone. Contracts were falling apart, equipment payments were overdue, and one bad month would have put him out of business. I had known. And I'd helped.
Not because Rick and I were close.
We weren't. I helped because Harold came to me one night and asked. I had emptied almost half of my retirement account. $90,000. I never told Linda. Rick never knew. Harold eventually repaid every dollar.
You saved him,
Harold said. I shook my head. I loaned him money. You gave him time. He looked toward the house. And he forgot who gave it to him. I didn't know what to say. Harold reached for my hand. That's why my wife made me promise something before she died.
What?
Never let money become the thing that destroys this family. His eyes filled with tears. I spent 12 years hoping my children would remember what mattered. He looked down. I was wrong. Check. Then he handed me the envelope. Don't open it.
I won't.
Not unless they leave you no choice. He squeezed my wrist. If you open it too soon, they'll destroy you before the truth gets a chance to speak. I slipped it inside my jacket. Neither of us spoke for a long time. When I finally stood to leave, Harold called my name. Michael. I turned. Thank you for showing up. Those were the last words he ever said to me. 3 weeks later, Harold died. Before sunrise. Quietly. The hospice nurse told us he passed with a Bible beside his bed and a photograph of his wife near his hand. At the funeral, Rick and Dennis stood near the front. They accepted condolences, shook hands, talked about the farm. Not their father. The farm. The property is going to be a lot to manage. There is a lot to take care of. I stood near the back. Linda found me before the service began. I heard you're still staying at the motel. I am. She looked exhausted. I never wanted this. Neither did I. I don't know how to fix it. I don't either. The pastor called everyone to their seats. We separated. 3 weeks later, Rick filed a lawsuit. His attorney claimed Harold had lacked the mental capacity to establish the trust. And then came the accusation that changed everything. Undue influence. According to Rick, I had isolated an elderly man after his stroke. I had driven him to an attorney. I had convinced him to change his estate. And I had done it because I wanted the farm. It was almost insulting. I hadn't asked Harold for $1. I hadn't asked for the farm. I hadn't even known the trust existed until Harold was already sitting in my truck. But Rick didn't need the story to be true. He only needed people to believe it was possible. The hearing took place on a gray January morning. Snow covered the courthouse steps. Inside, nearly every bench was occupied. Farmers Harold had known for decades. Church members. Neighbors. People who had already heard Rick's version. Susan leaned toward me before the judge entered. Don't react. I won't. Let the evidence do the work. The bailiff called the room to order. Rick's attorney stood. He was calm, polished, confident. He described Harold as vulnerable. He described me as an outsider. Then he looked directly at the judge. My client believes Mr. Carter exploited an elderly man at the most vulnerable point of his life. I looked down at my hands. I wanted to answer. I didn't. Susan stood. Your Honor, we have evidence that directly contradicts that narrative. Her first witness was Harold's neurologist. The doctor explained the stroke. Then he explained the cognitive evaluations performed before Harold signed the trust. Was Mr. Bennett confused? No. Did he show signs of dementia? No. Was he capable of understanding his decisions? Yes. Rick's attorney challenged him. The doctor didn't move. Would you have allowed Mr. Bennett to sign legal documents if you believed he couldn't understand them? No. The first accusation collapsed. Susan called herself next. She explained that she had met Harold privately. No children. No Michael. No family members. She had questioned him twice on separate days. His answers remained consistent. She had required independent witnesses. 2 legal assistants had observed every signature. I had only driven him there. Rick's attorney's confidence began to disappear. Then Susan reached into her briefcase. She pulled out the digital recorder. My stomach tightened.
Your Honor, we'd like to play Exhibit 12.
Static filled the courtroom. Then Rick's voice. If we split Southfield into residential lots, we'll make twice as much. Dennis laughed.
No point waiting forever.
Then Rick said the words I'd heard in my truck. Dad probably won't make another Christmas. The recording ended. Nobody moved. Even Rick's attorney seemed caught off guard. He stood quickly. Your Honor, this recording is incomplete and potentially misleading. Susan nodded.
It may be.
Then she smiled. Which is why we're not asking the court to rely on it alone. A screen behind her lit up. The first document appeared. Letter of intent, subject to probate. 3 months before Harold's stroke. I looked toward Rick. His face had gone pale. Another document appeared. Property maps. Proposed roads. Utility easements. Projected housing revenue. Then an email. Once Dad passes, we'll move quickly before the neighbors complain. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Rick's attorney stood. These were exploratory discussions. Susan didn't argue. She simply turned another page. Then perhaps Mr. Avery can explain the financial records. An older man walked toward the witness stand. Silver hair. Gray suit. I recognized him. Thomas Avery, Rick's former accountant. He took the oath. Susan asked why he'd agreed to testify. He looked at Rick. Because Harold deserved better. Rick shifted in his seat. Thomas explained that Rick had asked him to calculate expected profits from selling the farm. Then came the part nobody in the room expected. Rick had already been dealing with a development company. Money had been placed into escrow. Not enough to complete a sale, but enough to prove Rick had been preparing for one. Before Harold was even gone. Rick's attorney objected. Susan produced certified records. The judge reviewed them.
Overruled.
Thomas continued. Mr. Bennett's sons expected the property to be sold after probate. Rick's face had lost all color. Dennis stared at the floor. I thought we'd won. Then Susan turned toward me. Mr. Carter. She held up a sealed envelope. My envelope. The one Harold had told me never to open unless they left me no choice. I walked to the witness stand. The courtroom became silent. For weeks, I'd carried that envelope without opening it. Now there was nowhere left to hide. I looked at the judge. May I read this? He nodded. I broke the seal. Inside were several handwritten pages. The first line was addressed to his children. My hands started shaking. I unfolded the page. And then I saw my name. Not at the end. Not in the middle. The very first paragraph. I looked up. For the first time that morning, Rick looked genuinely afraid. I lowered my eyes to the page and began to read. My children. My children. The words looked almost too simple for what they carried. I took a breath. If you're hearing these words, I'm gone. The courtroom was silent. I continued. I loved each of you more than you will ever know. But love cannot survive without honesty. My eyes moved down the page.
Rick, you measured this farm in dollars while I was still measuring my remaining days.
Rick shifted in his chair. Dennis, you missed moments that can never be rescheduled. Dennis stared at the floor. Then I reached the paragraph that had my name in it.
And Michael.
My voice caught. I stopped. For a moment, I couldn't continue. I had known Harold for 30 years. I'd sat beside him on that porch. I'd repaired fences with him. I'd listened to him talk about weather, cattle, his wife, and things that never seemed important until after he was gone. Now his handwriting was telling an entire courtroom why he'd trusted me. I swallowed.
The only man who never asked me for anything is the one person I trusted with everything that truly mattered.
I looked up. Linda was crying. Rick wasn't. He was staring at me. I continued. Not because he married into this family, because he showed up when everyone else found an excuse. The room stayed silent. Then a chair scraped against the floor behind me. I turned. Linda was standing. Her face was wet with tears. She looked at the judge. Your Honor. Rick immediately turned around. Linda. She didn't respond. Sit down. She kept walking. I need to say something. The judge nodded. You may. Linda took a breath. For 30 years, I let other people tell me what kind of husband Michael was. Her voice shook. I let my brother's opinions become my opinions. Rick stood. That's enough. She finally looked at him. No. One word. Quiet. But it was the first time I'd ever heard Linda speak to Rick that way. She turned back toward the judge. I never stopped long enough to see Michael for myself. Rick's attorney leaned toward him. Mr. Bennett, please sit down. Rick ignored him. Linda continued. He never asked my father for money. She wiped her cheek. He never asked for the farm. Then she looked directly at me. He never asked for anything. Her voice broke. I was wrong. Rick's face hardened. You don't know what you're talking about. Linda looked at him. I know exactly what I'm talking about. You're my sister. And he's my husband. Rick laughed bitterly. After what he's done? Linda's expression changed. Not anger. Something worse. Disappointment. You still don't understand. Rick stared at her. What? You've spent months trying to prove Michael wanted Dad's money. She looked at the letter in my hands. Dad knew better. The judge raised his hand. Enough. Everyone went quiet. He reviewed the documents again. Then he looked toward Rick. Mr. Bennett, the evidence before this court establishes that your father acted knowingly and voluntarily. Rick's attorney stood. Your Honor. The judge continued. The medical testimony establishes capacity. He lifted the financial documents. The records establish that plans to sell the property existed before the alleged influence. He glanced at the recorder.
and the recording raises serious questions about the motives of the petitioners. Rick's attorney tried again. We respectfully request the trust remains in force.
The gavel struck once. That was it.
After months of rumors, accusations, investigators, canceled contracts, and people looking at me as though I had stolen something, the truth had finally been spoken in a room where nobody could whisper over it. But the courtroom victory didn't feel like a victory. Not yet. Because Linda was sitting alone in the back row. And I knew the real damage between us hadn't been repaired. 2 weeks later, Susan called. I need you to come to my office. I almost asked why. Then I remembered Harold. Is something wrong? No. She paused. Something is finished. When I arrived, the winter snow had started melting. The fields outside her office were muddy and brown. Susan placed a thick binder on the table. The judge signed the final order this morning. I sat down. What happens now? She opened the binder. The Bennett Family Trust remains intact. I read the documents. The farm could not be sold by any individual family member. No one could borrow against it. No one could divide it into residential lots without satisfying conditions Harold had deliberately made extremely difficult. I turned another page, then stopped. My name was there. I looked at Susan. What is this? She didn't answer immediately. I read the line again. Successor trustee, Michael Carter. I looked up. I don't own the farm. No. Then why is my name here? Because Harold didn't want you to own it. That surprised me. Susan leaned back. He wanted someone who wouldn't. I stared at the page. For 30 years, I'd watched people measure each other by possessions. Cars. Businesses. Land. Bank accounts. Harold had done something completely different. He had handed me responsibility. Not wealth. Responsibility. Until when? I asked. Susan smiled. As long as you're willing. I looked down at Harold's signature. He had known exactly what he was doing. Rick and Dennis weren't completely disinherited. That would have been revenge. Harold hadn't wanted revenge. Each son received a modest inheritance. But because they'd challenged the trust in bad faith and violated its no-contest provisions, they lost control over the property. They could have money. They couldn't have the farm. That distinction mattered. Rick appealed. His attorney advised him to stop. The evidence was overwhelming. Then the consequences began arriving quietly. Rick lost 2 commercial landscaping contracts. No lawsuit. No campaign against him. No interference from me. People simply stopped trusting him. Dennis stayed in commercial real estate, but farmers he'd known for years stopped returning his calls. Again, I did nothing. I didn't have to. Small towns remember. Eventually, people decide for themselves who they trust. Still, becoming trustee didn't suddenly make me a farmer. I knew almost nothing about running hundreds of acres. So I called Harold's longtime neighbor, Ben Walker. We sat in his pickup overlooking the fields.
You interested in leasing it? I asked. Ben smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. We worked out a fair arrangement. No complicated negotiation. Just honest numbers and a handshake. Susan handled the paperwork. The field stayed productive. The fences were repaired. The old red barn got a fresh coat of paint. And slowly, the place began looking less like an inheritance dispute, and more like the home Harold had always wanted it to be. But there was one person I still hadn't figured out. Linda. We were technically still married. But 30 years of marriage doesn't disappear because a judge signs a document. Neither does 30 years of hurt. For months, we kept our distance. Then, one Saturday in September, I decided to do something Harold had talked about for years. A harvest festival. Nothing extravagant. A local church youth group ran a bake sale. The volunteer fire department grilled burgers. Kids rode hay wagons through the fields. An old bluegrass band played under a white tent. Neighbors brought pies. Veterans brought old photographs. For the first time since Harold died, the farm sounded alive. Children laughing. Music. People talking. The smell of grilled food drifting across the fields. I stood near the barn, watching two kids argue over who got to feed the goats. Then I noticed a black SUV slowing on the county road. Rick. He didn't turn in. He simply stopped. For a few seconds, he watched the farm. Children ran through the pumpkin patch. Older couples sat in folding chairs. Neighbors laughed. Then Rick drove away. Nobody waved. Nobody shouted. Most people didn't even notice. Sometimes being forgotten hurts more than being hated. A little later, I saw Linda near the cider stand. She was alone. She looked uncomfortable, almost like a guest. I walked over. I'm glad you came. She smiled faintly. So am I. We stood there awkwardly. Then she laughed. I heard the goats escaped twice. 3 times. She looked surprised. 3? The third one was my fault. She laughed again. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her in months. That evening, we sat together on the old porch. The same porch where Harold and I had spent so many mornings. Linda held a cup of coffee. I've been going to counseling, she said. I know. She looked at me. The pastor mentioned it. She nodded. I've got a lot to work on. So do I. She looked toward the fields. I don't expect you to forget. I don't expect myself to forget. She nodded slowly. There was no dramatic apology. No promise that everything would suddenly become perfect. We both knew better. Some damage doesn't disappear because someone says sorry. It gets repaired slowly. A conversation. A phone call. Dinner. Listening. Choosing not to walk away when walking away would be easier. By Thanksgiving, we were spending weekends together again. Not because everything was fixed. Because we had finally stopped pretending nothing had broken. And then, a few weeks before Christmas, I went to Harold's grave. Snow covered the cemetery. The fields beyond it were white. I brought something with me. An old pair of leather work gloves. Harold had left them in my truck years earlier, after we'd repaired a fence together. I'd kept them ever since. I placed them gently against the headstone. "Still showing up," I whispered. The wind moved through the dry grass. I stood there for a long time and finally understood something. Harold hadn't chosen me because I was the strongest man in the family. He hadn't chosen me because I knew more about money. He hadn't chosen me because I was perfect. He chose me because when everyone else found an excuse, I showed up. But there was still one question people kept asking whenever they heard the story. Did I inherit the farm? The answer was no. And that was exactly the point. Because what Harold left me was worth far more complicated than ownership. It was the responsibility to make sure the place remained what it had always been. A home. A piece of land. And a memory of the man who had finally decided that his family should stop measuring love in dollars. But there was one final thing I hadn't yet realized about the trust. Susan had kept one page separate from the rest. And when she finally showed it to me, I understood why Harold had insisted that I never open the envelope too early. The page Susan showed me wasn't another secret inheritance. It was the part of Harold's trust that explained exactly why he'd been so careful. I looked down at the document, then back at her. What am I looking at? The provision that protects the farm after your appointment. I read it again. Harold hadn't simply prevented his children from selling the property. He had built layers of protection around it. No individual beneficiary could force a sale. No one could borrow against it. No one could divide it for development. And if anyone challenged the trust in bad faith, they risked losing the very inheritance they were fighting over. I leaned back. He planned all of this. Susan nodded. Long before the stroke. That brought me back to the brass key. The fireproof cabinet. 7 years. The handwritten notes. Harold hadn't made those decisions because he was afraid of dying. He'd made them because he'd spent years watching his family change. And perhaps the hardest part was realizing that he hadn't suddenly stopped loving his children. He had simply stopped trusting them with what he loved. I drove back to the farm that afternoon. The fields were quiet. The old red barn stood against the winter sky. For the first time, I understood what Harold had been trying to protect. It wasn't just land. It was the life attached to it. The porch where we'd drink coffee. The fence we'd repaired together. The fields his wife had walked through. The place where his children had grown up. And maybe that was why selling it had bothered him so much. To Rick, it was acreage. To Dennis, it was a development opportunity. To Harold, it was home. That difference had destroyed the family long before anyone entered a courtroom. Rick appealed the ruling. His attorney argued that the trust restrictions were excessive. Susan wasn't worried. Neither was I. The evidence from the first hearing hadn't disappeared. The medical records were still there. The recordings were still there. The emails were still there. The development documents were still there. And Harold's letter was still there. The appeal ended quietly. No dramatic courtroom victory. No cameras. Just a decision upholding the original ruling. Rick had lost the fight. But I didn't feel like I'd won. Because by then, I'd learned something about winning family disputes. Nobody walks away untouched. Rick lost control of the property. Dennis lost the future profits he'd already counted. Linda lost the certainty she'd had about the man she'd married. And I lost the version of my marriage I'd spent 30 years believing in. That was the price. Even when the truth finally came out, it didn't give those years back. Rick's landscaping company started losing contracts. I heard about it through people in town. Then another. Then another. I never called anyone. Never asked anyone to stop doing business with him. I didn't need to. People had watched the hearing. They had heard the recording. They had seen the documents. Eventually, they made their own decisions. Dennis had a harder time, too. Farmers who once returned his calls stopped answering. Some told him directly they didn't trust him. Again, I did nothing. There was no reason to. Harold had already taught me the difference between revenge and consequences. Revenge means you make someone suffer because you want them to hurt. Consequences mean you step aside and let people decide what they think of someone's choices. I chose the second. The farm came first. I knew enough about business to know what I didn't know about farming. So I called Ben Walker. He had worked the neighboring fields for years. We sat in his pickup one afternoon overlooking the property. "You want to lease it?" I asked. He smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask." We worked out a fair agreement. No games. No inflated numbers. No attempt to squeeze every dollar from the land. Just something Harold would have understood. A handshake. An honest deal. The fields stayed green. The fences were repaired. The old barn got a new coat of paint. And slowly, the farm stopped feeling like the center of a family war. It started feeling alive again. That was when I remembered something Harold had once said. Land is only valuable if somebody knows what it's for. I finally understood. He hadn't wanted a bigger bank account. He wanted the farm to remain a place where people belonged. So in September, I organized a harvest festival. It wasn't a business event. There was nothing to sell. The local church youth group ran a bake sale. The volunteer fire department cooked hamburgers and hot dogs. Kids rode hay wagons through the fields. An old bluegrass band played under a white tent. Veterans brought photographs and stories. Neighbors brought pies. Someone set up tables beneath the maple trees. By late afternoon, the entire farm was filled with voices. Children ran through the pumpkin patch. People laughed near the barn. The smell of grilled food drifted across the fields. For the first time since Harold died, I could almost imagine him walking onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Then I saw the black SUV. It slowed on the county road. Rick. He didn't turn into the driveway. He just sat there, watching. From where I stood, I could see what he saw. Children laughing. Older couples sitting in folding chairs. Neighbors talking. The barn painted red again. The land alive. Not divided into housing lots. Not covered with expensive houses.
not turned into a number on a spreadsheet. Alive. Rick stayed for several seconds. Then he drove away. Nobody waved. Nobody shouted. Most people didn't even notice. I watched the SUV disappear around the bend, and I realized something. Being forgotten can hurt more than being hated. A few minutes later, Linda arrived. Alone. She stood near the cider table, looking around as though she wasn't sure she belonged there anymore. I walked toward her. "I'm glad you came." She smiled. "So am I." Neither of us knew what to say. Then she glanced toward the fields. "I heard the goats escaped." "Twice." She laughed. "Only twice?" "3 times." Her eyes widened. "You're kidding." "I caught the 3rd one myself." She laughed again. It wasn't a huge moment. No music. No dramatic embrace. Just a laugh. But it was the first genuine one we'd shared in months. Later, after the crowd began thinning, Linda and I sat on Harold's porch. The same porch where he'd taught me that silence didn't always mean there was nothing to say. Linda held a cup of coffee between both hands. "I've been going to counseling." "I know." She looked at me. "The pastor told you?" "He mentioned it." She nodded. "I have a lot to work on." "So do I." She looked toward the fields. "I don't expect you to forget what happened." "I don't think forgetting is the answer." "What is?" I thought about it. "Remembering without letting it control us." She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded. There was no dramatic promise. No declaration that everything was fixed. 30 years of marriage didn't disappear overnight. Neither did 30 years of resentment. We started slowly. A phone call. Dinner. A weekend together. Another conversation. Sometimes we disagreed. Sometimes we stopped talking. But we stopped pretending. And that mattered. By Thanksgiving, we were spending weekends together again. Not because the pain had vanished. Because we had finally decided the truth was better than another comfortable lie. A few weeks before Christmas, I drove to Harold's grave. Snow covered the cemetery. The fields beyond it were white. I carried something simple. An old pair of leather work gloves. Harold had left them in my truck years earlier, after we'd repaired a fence together. I'd kept them all those years. I placed them gently against the headstone. "Still showing up," I whispered. The wind moved through the dry grass. I stood there, alone. And for the first time since the hospital, I wasn't angry. Not at Rick. Not at Dennis. Not even at Linda. I was just tired. Tired of measuring everything by what had been taken. Harold had lost his wife. He'd nearly lost his farm. He'd lost the trust of his sons. And in the end, he'd lost his life. But he had still chosen what mattered most. He chose to leave something behind that couldn't be measured by money. Trust. Responsibility. Memory. I touched the old gloves once before turning away. And as I walked back toward my truck, I realized the question people kept asking me had never really been the important one. They always wanted to know whether I had inherited Harold's farm. The answer was simple. No. I hadn't inherited the farm. I had inherited the responsibility to make sure it survived. And that was worth more than owning every acre of it. But there was still one thing I hadn't told anyone. Not Rick. Not Dennis. Not even Linda. The reason Harold had trusted me wasn't simply because I had driven him to the lawyer that morning. It went back much further, to a summer 12 years earlier, to $90,000, and to a promise I had made that I thought had already been repaid in full. The truth about the $90,000 was never meant to become another weapon. Harold had kept it quiet for 12 years because he believed some debts were better left between the people who understood why they existed. Rick's landscaping company had been collapsing. Contracts were disappearing. Equipment payments were overdue. One more bad month would have ended everything. Harold had come to me because he couldn't help his son without risking his own retirement. So I did what I could. I emptied almost half of mine. $90,000. I didn't tell Linda. I didn't tell Rick. I didn't tell anyone. Rick eventually recovered. The money was repaid. And as far as I was concerned, the matter was finished. But Harold remembered. He remembered that when his son needed help, I gave it without asking for recognition. He remembered every time I showed up when nobody else did. And that was why, 12 years later, when he heard his sons discussing the farm like their father was already dead, he knew exactly who he could trust. Not the man who wanted the land. The man who had already proven he didn't. That realization changed the way I looked at everything. Rick hadn't lost the farm because I took it from him. Dennis hadn't lost his future development because I interfered. They lost control because their father had finally decided that control and love were not the same thing. Harold had given his children chances. For years. Maybe too many. He had hoped they'd eventually remember the difference between owning something and caring for it. They never did. I did. And that was why the farm remained. Not because I was some brilliant businessman. I wasn't. Not because I knew how to farm. I didn't. I simply knew what Harold wanted. So I kept the land productive. Ben Walker continued leasing the fields. The fences stayed repaired. The barn remained standing. The old farmhouse stayed exactly where it belonged. No subdivision. No development signs. No bulldozers. No rows of expensive houses where Harold's cattle used to graze. And slowly, the farm became something different. Not an inheritance battlefield. A gathering place. That harvest festival was only the beginning. The following spring, neighbors began asking whether they could use the property for community events. A veterans group wanted to hold a small memorial gathering. The church wanted to organize another harvest celebration. Ben suggested opening part of the property for local families during the fall. I said yes. Because every time people filled that field, I could almost hear Harold saying the same thing he'd said on the porch for years. Coffee's fresh. It was strange. A man can spend 30 years thinking he knows exactly what his life is supposed to look like. Then, one phone call changes everything. One drive. One secret. One decision.
And suddenly the life you thought you understood isn't the life you're living anymore. Linda and I learned that the hard way. We didn't magically repair 30 years of marriage. There were no dramatic promises. No overnight transformation. Some wounds don't disappear because the truth finally comes out. They have to be lived through. We went slowly. Counseling. Dinner. Long conversations. Sometimes silence. Sometimes arguments. Sometimes one of us would remember something from those months, and the old anger would come back. But there was one difference. We stopped pretending. Linda eventually told me that she'd spent years comparing me to her brothers. She had never said it aloud before. She thought their businesses meant they were successful. She thought my quiet life meant I lacked ambition. She mistook confidence for character. And when Rick told her I'd manipulated Harold, part of her believed it, because it fit the picture she'd been taught to see. "I was looking at you through their eyes," she told me one night. I didn't know how to answer. So I told her the truth. I was looking at you through my own hurt. That conversation changed something. Not everything, but something. By Thanksgiving, we were spending weekends together again. By Christmas, we had stopped talking about whether the marriage could be saved. We were simply trying to live honestly and see what happened. That was enough. Rick never apologized. Neither did Dennis. Maybe someday they will. Maybe they won't. I stopped waiting for it. That was another thing Harold taught me without ever saying it directly. You can't force someone to become the person you hoped they would be. You can only decide who you're going to be when they don't. Rick eventually moved on. His landscaping company became smaller. Dennis continued working in real estate. Neither man ended up ruined. That was never what Harold wanted. He didn't want his sons destroyed. He wanted them to understand that their actions had consequences. And they did. People in Lancaster remembered what happened. Not because I told them. Because they had watched it happen. The courtroom. The documents. The recording. The letter. They had heard Harold's own words. That was enough. As for me, I went back to living a quieter life. I still drove my old Ford F-150. Still fixed things around the house. Still carried the scars on my hands. I didn't suddenly become wealthy. I didn't buy a bigger house. I didn't need to. One evening, months after everything had settled, I stood on the farmhouse porch at sunset. The fields were gold. The barn was freshly painted. A tractor moved slowly in the distance. Linda stood beside me. Neither of us spoke. She handed me a cup of coffee. I looked at it. Then at her. She smiled. "Coffee's fresh." I laughed. It was such a small thing. But for a second, I could hear Harold again. Not as a memory. As something alive. I thought about the morning at the hospital. His hand gripping my arm. His frightened eyes. "Don't take me home." At the time, I thought he was asking me to protect him. Now I understood. He was asking me to help him finish something he'd started years earlier. He wanted one last chance to protect the place his wife had loved. He wanted his children to learn that blood doesn't automatically make someone trustworthy. And he wanted me to understand something I'd spent most of my life overlooking. Showing up matters. Not when it's convenient. Not when there's money involved. Not when people are watching. You show up because someone needs you. That's what Harold remembered. That's why he trusted me. And that's why, when the time came, he didn't leave me the farm. He left me the responsibility of protecting it. People still ask me whether I ever wished things had gone differently. Of course I do. I wish Harold hadn't gotten sick. I wish his sons had chosen differently. I wish Linda had believed me sooner. I wish 30 years of marriage hadn't been tested by a secret that never should have existed. But wishing doesn't change what happened. What matters is what you do after the truth finally arrives. I drove more than 100 miles that morning because everyone else had an excuse. I thought I was simply picking up an old man from the hospital. Instead, I became the person he trusted with the final chapter of his life. And I learned something I wish I'd understood much earlier. A family isn't defined by who shares your last name. It's defined by who shows up when there's nothing to gain. Rick and Dennis wanted the farm because they saw its value. Harold trusted me because he saw mine. And in the end, that was the inheritance that mattered. Not the acres. Not the money. Not the trust documents. The trust itself. Years later, whenever I drive onto that property and see children running across the same fields Harold once walked, I remember that October morning. The hospital. The track. The locked doors. The recorder. The lawyer's office. The sealed envelope. The courtroom. And the old man who looked at me and said the words that changed my life. Thank you for showing up. I still have those leather work gloves. They're hanging beside the back door of the farmhouse. They're worn. Cracked. Almost useless now. But I keep them there anyway. Because every time I see them, I remember Harold. And I remember the promise. Keep the farm. Protect what matters. Don't let money decide who deserves to be loved. And most of all, keep showing up. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only person standing between a family and the truth. And sometimes the greatest thing a man can inherit isn't something he can own at all.